Welcome to the endocrine system. In this tutorial, I'll review the basics of endocrine signaling. I'm Dr. Catherine Moore, the Histology Wizard. In these tutorials, we've been discussing the structure and function of the cells, tissues, and organs that make up the human body. These components and their activities have to be integrated and coordinated, and there are two systems who perform that job, the nervous and endocrine systems. Now, these systems are not redundant, but instead they work together. The key activity of both of the systems is signaling, but how each system accomplishes this signaling is different. So let's first compare and contrast how each system accomplishes their signaling. Let's first compare and contrast some of the general characteristics of the nervous and endocrine systems, specifically in terms of how each one performs its job of signaling. First, each system communicates in a different way. The nervous system via electrical impulses and neurotransmitters, and the endocrine system with hormones. The release of the signals is also different, since neurotransmitters are released at synapses at specific target cells, while hormones are released into the blood. And each mode of release then is going to determine the distance at which these signals can act, with the nervous system acting locally while hormones act at greater distances from their release locations. The method of release also determines the speed at which each system can react. So synaptic signaling occurs much more rapidly than hormonal signaling. And finally, those systems differ in their abilities to cease responding to a signal. So the nervous system can more quickly respond to changes in a stimulus, while the endocrine system may continue to respond after the stimulus has ceased. Let's think about this again using a simple cartoon. Here, cell A is signaling to cell B via neurotransmitters, and so these cells must be in direct contact or at least close together. This requirement for close proximity means the signal reception and termination are for the most part guaranteed, but it also means this kind of signaling is confined to a smaller local area. So this system is designed for local signaling, much as if I were walking into the next room in order to talk to my husband. In contrast, the release of hormone into blood means that these signals can go anywhere the blood goes, which is great in terms of the ability to signal to locations farther from cell A, and much, much cheaper, but the response is much slower, just as if I have to get into my car, ride the bus, take the train to get to work to talk to my coworkers. And further, there's a risk that signaling will not reach the intended targets. So what exactly is the endocrine system? Well, the endocrine system consists of all the cells, tissues, and organs that secrete hormones. So these can be peptides, lipids, amino acid derivatives. They're all released into the circulation, they bind on receptors, either on or in target cells, and they function to regulate their activity. And some of these processes regulated by hormones include blood pressure, composition, metabolism, energy balance, growth, development, and even reproduction. Now, where do we find endocrine cells? Well, there are endocrine glands, where the entire parenchyma is specialized for hormone production. There are also discrete clusters of cells and organs that have other functions, such as the pancreas or liver or ovary. And finally, we have isolated cells, so single hormone-producing cells, or what's sometimes known as the diffuse neuroendocrine system. And these cells can be interspersed in the epithelia of the digestive and respiratory systems, for example. Now let's review the similarities and differences between an exocrine and an endocrine gland. First, both produce and secrete products, but exocrine organs or glands are going to secrete products, and these ducts are going to transport the products onto an epithelial surface, essentially to outside the body, such as sweat from sweat glands. And in contrast, endocrine glands are usually ductless, and they secrete their products directly into the blood. And because of this, they have a very abundant blood supply, lots of parenchyma, but very little stroma. And examples here include the pancreas and the pituitary gland. The example shown here in the cartoon is the classic endocrine signaling, where the target is distant from the source. But these hormones can also affect neighboring cells, so this is paracrine signaling, or they can affect themselves, and this is autocrine signaling. And a key point to remember is that even though these hormones are broadly circulating, the effects are confined to target tissues, to whatever cells express the appropriate hormone receptor. Endocrine signaling needs to be regulated in order to maintain homeostasis, and recall that homeostasis is the state of metabolic or physiologic balance. Hormone secretion is highly regulated by various mechanisms, including hormonal signals from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Hormone secretion is also regulated by a process termed feedback. So briefly, a hormone activates its target cell, a signal is generated, and either directly or indirectly, this signal can halt or increase hormone production. And this feedback can be positive, but in most cases it's negative or feedback inhibition. And if hormone levels are insufficient to elicit an appropriate response in a target cell, a positive feedback signal can be released, which would trigger an increase in hormone secretion. So let's think about that for a minute. Let's imagine this elephant as a hormone signal. If an elephant starts running and an appropriate response doesn't occur, so say for example a human running away, more elephants might begin to run. And soon more and more elephants are stampeding until the desired response is elicited. So what exactly does positive feedback do? Well, it reinforces or increases changes in a controlled environment. So think about that one elephant running to a whole herd stampeding. Positive feedback tends to make a system more unstable. Now, what helps to restabilize the situation? Well, usually there's one event that will discontinue the signal. Now, when do we see positive feedback, for example, in the body? Well, it's used to control infrequent conditions such as ovulation, childbirth, and blood clotting. Here, for example, we see the actions of oxytocin in childbirth. This hormone stimulates uterine contractions, and the more contractions, the more oxytocin is released, and the contractions increase, and so on. And this continues essentially until the baby is delivered, when the production and release of oxytocin will cease. Now, what about the more common negative feedback or feedback inhibition? In this case, when a hormone activates its target cell, an inhibitory signal is generated, either directly or indirectly, to halt hormone production. So here's an example. Heating your house in the winter when the temperature falls below 65. So a signal will turn the thermostat on. And this is going to reverse that low temperature. And once the temperature moves towards 65, which is your desired result, the thermostat will shut off. So the increase will be dampened, and the room will cool down. So negative feedback serves to dampen or reverse changes, acting to inhibit an original signal, which in this case was to increase the heat in the room to get it into the desired range. And this type of feedback is critical for keeping systems stable. So let's look at a hormonal example. Here I'm showing the hypothalamus and pituitary on the top of the cartoon and the thyroid gland below. A stimulus, in this case low body temperature, will cause the hypothalamus to secrete thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH. This will signal via the blood to the anterior pituitary, and we'll discuss that in a later video. Cells in the pituitary will release thyroid-stimulating hormone, which signals to the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, then, is going to function in its target tissues to increase metabolic activity. In this case, as the body temperature increases, thyroid hormone is going to feed back on both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to shut off TRH and TSH, and eventually this will reduce the release of thyroid hormone. So if we go back to our simple cartoon, in effect we can think of this as three tissues or cells. Tissue A will signal to tissue B to release a product, which then targets tissue C, and the product of tissue C will then feed back to inhibit cell B as well as cell A. So here's our first simplified diagram, but in fact most of our feedback systems in the body are more complicated than shown here. Why is this? Well, it's important to remember that many hormones are secreted with circadian or pulsatile patterns, and these patterns need to be maintained. For example, in the female reproductive system, specific timing of release of hormones is critical to regulate the ovarian and menstrual cycles. One method of birth control is to smooth out those cyclical patterns of hormones. So many systems employ complicated feedback systems, and these are often called an axis, involving the hypothalamus and pituitary gland plus a target organ. So one example is the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. And these systems are common probably because they are more stable than simple feedback systems. Well, that was a quick trip through endocrine signaling, and if you found this video helpful, be sure to like it. To learn more about how the histology of specific endocrine organs informs their functions, check out the tutorials on the pituitary and the adrenal glands. Thanks for stopping by.